great to be here with the GBC. Thank you very much for inviting me. What I'd like to talk about today are three words that are really on my mind as we think about the challenges of cities all over America today, particularly in the post-George Floyd killing era. And for me, those three words are intentional, ownership, and this is more than three words, but complex adaptive coalitions. So let me talk about all three for a second. Intentional. Well, a lot of this actually, my connection to GBC started with my friend Calvin Butler. That actually started after the killing of George Floyd. We were both members at Caves Valley, and I was up playing one day with my wife, and Calvin was playing with three of his friends, and they're all Black members, and they're all sitting at a table next to us after lunch, and all I could think about as a reporter was, God, I'd sure like to know what they're saying and thinking right now. And so after that lunch, I actually intentionally walked up to Calvin on the practice tee. He was out there practicing. He's always practicing. He's always trying to get better than me. And I said, Calvin, what good is it to belong to a diverse club if people actually don't play together? Would you play golf with me? And that began a much deeper friendship and ended up with me speaking to this board this morning. I think this point of being intentional is really what is new. There's a lot of laws on the books promoting civil rights, equity, and inclusion. We try to build a diverse club where we are. A lot of things on paper, but really now is the time to take them from on paper to being very intentional about how you actually deliver sustainable change. And that brings me to the word ownership. So I don't know a lot about Baltimore, but I do know a lot about a city a lot like Baltimore that's been in the news a lot. It's called Minneapolis, and Minneapolis is my hometown. I was actually born a couple miles from where George Floyd was killed. So I've watched with just, great sense of depression and just disappointment at how everything has evolved in Minneapolis. And I happen to know a lot about the community activities there, the attempts to build a more inclusive community, because I wrote about them in my last book, Thank You for Being Late. And I wrote about, in particular, something called Itasca. Now, Itasca was a project begun by the predominantly white city fathers of Minneapolis, going back to the 50s. It was the business leadership that came together. These were the big families, the Daytons and the Bushes from McKnight families, the 3M families. They came together actually to support community projects. And they would all vacation together every summer, this is in the 50s, in northern Minnesota at a place called Lake Itasca. Well, their kids and grandkids in the leadership of the community came together in the early 2000s and created what they called the Itasca Business Council. And it was really all the big business leaders in the city that came together. And part of their mission was to build a more inclusive city and one where equity and inclusion would be high priorities. But it was very much business design, business led, and predominantly white business led on how do we make for a more inclusive community. And they did a lot of wonderful things. Well, the leaders of Itasca woke up after the killing of George Floyd and really looked in the mirror and said, we failed. Whatever we were doing, it didn't work. And so Minneapolis, unfortunately, has been a leader on the downside here. What I'm hoping for is they can also lead on the solutions, on the way out with a new approach to this kind of community-led solutions. And that's what's going on there right now. You haven't read about it much, but it's actually going on. It's actually quite important. And basically what happened is the leaders of Itasca came together with African-American leaders in the community, and they formed something they called the Alliance of Alliances. And they've asked a Black-led group called the African-American Leadership Forum to actually provide the day-to-day operations. And the whole idea of this kind of Itasca 2.0 is that it will be Black-led. The projects will be Black designed. The predominantly white business community will provide resources. It will be a decade-long agenda with clear metrics. to make defined progress in the areas where Black Minnesotans and Minnesotans of color in general have clearly lagged. That's educational achievement, employment, income, healthcare, housing, and public safety. And the whole idea from the Itasca side is that, well, we're not going to do reform to them. We are going to do reform by them, with them, led by the Black community, defined by the Black community, with metrics determined by the Black community. And, you know, I have a lot of hope for this. There's a lot of people in Minneapolis who want to get caught trying. They know what they were doing before has failed. They know that they've got to do things differently this time, with more Black leaders leading it and more Black members of the community actually designing it. So, because when you do that, you end up with the most important metric, which is ownership. Before, it really was not owned by the Black leadership with their metrics, their goals, their aspirations. And ownership is just hugely important. I'm a big believer that in the history of the world, no one has ever washed a rented car. And in the history of the world, no one has also washed a rented street, a rented community. And so I urge you in the GBC to pay attention to what's going on in Minneapolis. There's been a lot of bad news out of there, but there's a lot of people there who want to get caught trying a very new approach. And that leads me to my third word of the day. I said it's not a word, it's a phrase: complex adaptive coalition. And this term is something I coined again, and thank you for being late. And basically my view of the world right now is we're going through three climate changes at once. We're going through a change of the climate, we're going through a change of the climate of technology, and we're going through a change of the climate in globalization. And if you look at nature, when climate changes in nature, which ecosystems thrive or survive? There are those that build complex adaptive networks where the different elements of the ecosystem all network together to maximize their resilience and propulsion. Well, I've actually taken that concept from nature and applied it to human communities. And a couple of years ago now, I wrote about one that, again, that I'm an expert on, and it's a community called Wilmer, Minnesota. And you may think, Friedman, we hired you to talk about Baltimore. I don't know anything about Baltimore, but I'm going to tell you a story about Wilmer, Minnesota, and you will understand the connection and why it's relevant. So why am I an expert on Wilmer, Minnesota? Because in 1949, after the war, my aunt and uncle moved from Minneapolis to Wilmer. And Wilmer's in west central Minnesota. It's about 2 hours west of the Twin Cities, but equidistant between the Twin Cities and the Dakota borders. They moved there in 1949 to start a little steel company. At that time, Wilmer, Minnesota was 99.999% white, Protestant, Catholic, German, and Scandinavian immigrants. And they had three Jewish families in the town. My aunt and uncle were one of them, and they were the exotica, basically. Well, growing up, I went to Wilmer every summer and visited my aunt and uncle regularly and really got to know them, their friends, and the community. Around 1975, my aunt, their names were Bev and Hy Rosenbaum, my aunt came down to Minneapolis for a family event, and she pulled me aside and said, Tom, I was in the grocery store Saturday. And I heard someone speaking Spanish. Well, she thought that was the most exotic thing she could imagine. She never forgot it. Neither did I. That was really her first encounter with the other. So my aunt and uncle passed away about 10 years ago, and I kind of lost touch with Wilmer when one day I got visited by a woman named Dana Mortensen. She runs a wonderful education NGO called World Savvy. She came to see me in my Washington office and said she wanted me to give a talk for their group, and she mentioned they were working in Wilmer. I said, Wilmer, I went to Wilmer for 50 years. I've lost touch with it. I said, Dana, I'm going to make you a deal. I'm going to give you a free lecture if you'll set up a day for me in Wilmer. I really want to get updated. So we went out there. I actually brought a friend of mine from Israel who's an expert in small towns in Israel. And Dana brought Hamza Warfa, who's the leading Somali in the state of Minnesota government in workforce. And the four of us went off to Wilmer in her minivan. We were like the punchline to a joke. So a New York Times columnist, an Israeli, a Minnesota girl, and a Somali walk into a bar in Wilmer. Only we didn't walk into a bar. We actually walked into Wilmer High School, where we were met by the principal in the cavernous lobby of the school. And he showed us a world map hanging over the lobby of Wilmer High. It was a steel world map. And he explained that Wilmer High School students at the beginning of every senior year now take out a ladder and they put pins in this world map of every country represented by that year's senior class at Wilmer High. And the reason they do that is because Wilmer today is 50% Somali, Latino, and East Asian, 50%. A town that in 1949 was 99% white Protestant Catholic, German Scandinavian descent. That's how radically some of these towns in Western Minnesota have changed. And that's a lot of change. And so what's interesting also is that steel map was donated by the people who bought my aunt and uncle's steel company. So how's Wilmer doing? Actually, Wilmer's doing amazingly well. And what you find is the small towns in Minnesota that have managed inclusion are actually thriving. The ones that haven't been able to manage inclusion are all dying because their kids are moving away and they're getting no new fresh blood and immigrants and families and homeowners and business starter-uppers. So how did Wilmer do it? Well, Wilmer did it, I would argue, by bringing together what I see the elements of every successful town I visit. They built a complex adaptive coalition, first of all. And what that means, complex adaptive coalitions are where the business community partners with the philanthropic community, partners with the education community, partners with the social entrepreneur community, partners with the city government to actually manage the change. So the first thing that complex adaptive coalition in Wilmer was able to do was manage inclusion. Now, I'll be quite honest with you. We say that necessity is the mother of invention. Well, necessity is the mother of inclusion also. If you're a small town in West Central Minnesota and you are desperate for labor, you need everyone from people who can work in the Jennie-O turkey factory to people who are ag scientists. Well, suddenly you will not care of what the color of people's skin are, what God they pray to, who they sleep with. All you will care about are their social skills. Will they wake up, dress up, clean up, sit up, learn up, and shut up? And if they will, you can get a job in Wilmer today. So in other words, that necessity, the need for labor just busted through what were surely very real cultural, religious, and other prejudices or just ignorances. So the first thing Wilmer was able to do was manage inclusion. Second thing Wilmer was able to do, it had a high density of people like yourselves. It had a high density of what I like to call leaders without authority. These are leaders within the community who step up and just say, not going to happen here, not going to happen here. My granddad lived here, my mama lived here, I'm living here, I want my kids to live here, and I'm not going to let this town fail. So Wilmer had a high density of leaders without authority. And they were very important in the transition. The first Ramadan came along and the Somalis in Wilmer wanted to pray, but they had no mosque. And so the fire chief gave them the fire station. And a lot of people in the community weren't real happy about that. He said, too bad, these are our new neighbors. Somebody threw a pork bone at a Somali woman. Change doesn't just happen linearly. It's curvilinear, it's up and down. But he stuck to it. And these leaders without authority were the ones really who drove that inclusion. The third thing was that these leaders without authority all networked together into what I call that complex adaptive coalition. Business, philanthropists, educators, labor, social entrepreneurs, and city government, all creating a council, something like your council, to manage the change and get the most out of it and cushion the worst. And lastly, they got companies to invest in that change. So in the case of Wilmer, the biggest healthcare company in Minnesota, United Health, it was Blue Cross Blue Shield, Blue Cross Blue Shield, came together and challenged the Wilmer community. They asked the different leaders without authority to hold dinners in their homes. And anyone in the community could sign up to go to anybody's dinner. And at these dinners, they discussed what is it Wilmer needs in order to progress. And then all the dinners nominated someone to go to a community meeting, and the community together decided on when I wrote about it 2 years ago, 19 community projects. It ranged from a project to help Somali mothers identify autism earlier to a project where you'd have a daycare center for elders and little kids together. So for 2 years in a row, Blue Cross Blue Shield invested about $250,000 in funding these different community-led projects, community-defined, designed, and led projects. And I called up Blue Cross Blue Shield and said, why'd you guys do that? It's a lot of money. And they said, Tom, it's very simple. Healthy communities have healthier people. Healthier communities have healthier people. So my message to y'all today is really, as you think about Baltimore, I said I'm not an expert on Baltimore. I know a lot about Minneapolis and Wilmer and a little about Case Valley. Think about those three words: intentional, ownership, and complex adaptive coalitions. Thanks for having me.